Greetings, sailors, and welcome to The Final Frontier, not to be confused with a Star Trek film, which is the latest operation, and it's the first Tier 7 operation. To be honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's not bad per se, but of all the operations that I've played so far, which, well, is all of them, this is my least favourite. And it's got some okay points going for it, but there's a couple of particular criticisms that I have of it as well, including one thing with one of the secondary conditions where they really should not have done it that way, and it just becomes a matter of RNG, but we'll get to that. So, you can have up to 3 battleships, and as you can see, the battleships and the everything else spawn in separate locations. You've got basically a little atoll with an airbase and 4 forts, which you have to, well, the airbase is the main objective. You've got to protect that. If that gets blown up, then it's game over. But the forts also represent a secondary objective, so you've got to try and stop the bots from blowing up more than half. With the battleships, well, the battleships generally, I think, are probably the most easy class to do this in. It's kind of harsh on the cruisers, even though there will be a repair point that spawns in a little while. And as for destroyers, I think outside of gunboat destroyers, you're going to have a very hard time. Although, having said that, I've seen people do okay-ish in things like Shiratsuyus. But bear in mind that bots are actually, in some cases, better at dodging torpedoes than human players can be. So, given that there will be plenty of things spotting incoming torpedoes, then, yeah, it makes actually landing torp hits relatively difficult. But, I mean, it can be done. But overall, I would say battleships are the most comfortable class. And of cruisers, the available cruisers, I would say the Belfast, easily the Belfast. The Miyoko, maybe just because it's also got a decent amount of armour, but for the rest of them, the only other one that I could particularly recommend would be the Fiji, because you've got your own smoke and a heal. But the reason why cruisers are particularly tricky in this one is that you've got quite a few battleships, and they are higher tier battleships than we've had in other operations, generally speaking. And also the repair point, once it spawns in, is rather exposed. So even though you get, in non-battleships, you get 200 hit points a second heal with the repair point, you generally speaking, at the point where you need those repairs, you're under continuous fire, and there isn't really any shelter in that repair area. So you get a bit stuck unless you've got somebody to smoke you. So the first spawn has come in. As you can see, you start off with this blob of 3 battleships, Pensacola and some destroyers in the south. You also separately have a Cleveland that spawns on one of the air spawn points. There is an Atlanta that will spawn on the northern spawn point, and there's usually an Omaha that spawns to the north as well. So there we go, the Atlanta's just coming on the map now as we've killed the Cleveland. Those 2 AA cruisers that are on the air spawns you particularly have to kill, because you have to save at least 50 planes of the strike wings that come in, and the fighters. But more importantly, and this is a failure condition, if you don't save at least 8 out of the 10 transport aircraft, that's it. And I have had at least one run through where we didn't kill the cruisers in time and the transport aircraft got shot down. So that was a bit disappointing to fall at the first hurdle, pretty much. But it does absolutely reinforce the importance of taking those down. You absolutely have to kill them. You get a relatively generous time limit for doing so, however. So generally speaking, it's a good idea for one of the battleships at least to go up there and help out the bot Alba in killing the cruisers, well, particularly killing the Atlanta, because the Atlanta's dangerous. The actual spawns do vary quite a bit on this one. I mean, generally speaking, the transport aircraft will not go from the southern spawn, but I think I'm right in saying that the mid and the top air spawns, you can have the transport aircraft coming from either of those. There is quite a lot of variation in this one overall, I have to say, that the first couple of groups and the compositions of the ships are relatively fixed, but with the later spawn waves, it gets a bit more varied. And actually that's kind of one of my criticisms, well, not the variation exactly, but the fact that while this is relatively structured early on in terms of where the spawns are coming from, what the spawns are, and you know, you then being able to position yourself appropriately to deal with them. Later on, it ramps up the difficulty by just throwing a lot of stuff at you at once, and because there are 3 possible directions that they can be coming from, and you're effectively left stuck just defending the middle, and you're always going to be being attacked from at least 2 of those directions, then at that point it becomes really hard to... You can't predict, you can't position yourself, you just have to hang around the middle until the spawns happen, and then you have to try and scrabble to deal with it. And that is my major criticism of this, in that unlike the previous ones where you have some better idea of how things are going to progress, in this one it does just kind of degenerate into a bit of a scrabble, and it's just trying to hang on while the timer ticks down. So I've almost dealt with this first group. The repair station has spawned, and we'll be getting the carrier in at some point fairly soon as well. Now, because we've got our own carrier, it tends to be... Oh, there we go. Actually, the transport planes came from the southern spawn this time. So, yeah, in fact, the transport planes can come from any of those 3 air spawn areas. So, it's Raptor. It's Raptor from Raptor Rescue. So, it kind of ties in with one of the previous operations. And as it's a US carrier, it means it's got decent fighters, and it tends to more have dive bombers, although I think it does have a squad of torp bombers as well. But generally speaking, it's not that much of a threat to you, the player, but it will try and go after the forts. So if one of the cruisers is at least a decent AA cruiser and in position to defend the forts, that's quite good. You can also take a carrier yourself, and we have actually got a carrier in this particular round that we did, but I would say don't take a carrier, actually. I mean, Wargaming have made it progressively tougher for carriers in operations generally. And in this one, well, again, everything over tier 6 in terms of the cruisers has got a defensive AA. And because they're US cruisers, it's quite nasty AA. And all the lower tier cruisers have got like AA flags and things on anyway. But also, the US destroyers all have defensive AA as well. I think it's, what, tier 5 up, or is it tier 6 up? I can't remember. But it severely limits your offensive power in a carrier. And I've tried this even with a Saipan with tier 9 planes, and I was still really struggling not to lose planes. So you end up... because you can try and trigger the defensive AA and then just hang around your planes until the defensive goes down and then make your strike. But that then absolutely limits your attack power, because you're spending quite large amounts of time hanging your planes around doing nothing. And yes, you can then maybe try and concentrate on being a fighter carrier and taking out the enemy carrier's planes, but that's of somewhat limited value. And even trying to strike out Raptor is also difficult, because I think it's conditional on you having your own carrier. The Raptor spawn is always in the same place. It's down in H2, the little island that you can see in the southwest corner. But if you have your own carrier at that point, it will spawn with some additional ships. And I've seen it without any additional ships. Generally speaking, it's a Cleveland. It'll spawn with the Cleveland sat next to it if you've got a carrier. I might be wrong about this, but that's my experience. So, you know, that's one of the conditions, is you have to go and kill the carrier, but it's generally better to do that with a surface ship. So, we've got now another group of ships, and this is where one of the other secondaries kicks in. The destroyed 2 ships that are being attacked by the Aerodrome Squadron, so it's basically the marked ships. And this is where the rather BS RNG comes in, because there's always at least the first one being a cruiser. And in this case, it's a Marblehead. So any of one of this first group, the Phoenix, the Omaha, and the Marblehead, one of those will be a marked ship. And you've got roughly 2 minutes to kill this marked ship, and that's generally not difficult because, you know, it's a tier 4 or a tier 5 US light cruiser. What happens, however, is that the second of these, and you get 3 total of these marked ships, you get 3 opportunities and you have to kill at least 2 of them. It's possible for the second one that pops up, or I think even, well, I think the third one is always a battleship actually, but the second one can either be a battleship or it can be another cruiser, and if you get 2 out of 3 being cruisers, this is a relatively easy secondary condition to do. If you get 2 out of 3 being battleships, generally speaking, it's a lot harder and you're far more likely to fail this particular condition. So in this particular run through, we got 2 cruisers, so this is really easy. And if we can, you know, if I can just hit it, that would help. But yeah, it's not going to be difficult to kill these lightly armoured US cruisers. If, however, it turns out to be the Colorado in this next spawn from the south, you've got 3-ish minutes to kill a Colorado, which is far harsher than 2 minutes to kill a Phoenix in this case. Then you've got problems. Or, you know, it can also end up being a North Carolina or an Alabama in the final wave, which will also be a marked ship. And I'm struggling to think if I've had a single run through actually where it's been 2 battleships as marked ships, where we have actually successfully done that secondary condition. Generally speaking, if it's the 2 cruisers, you can do it and it's fine. But if you are unlucky and you get the 2 battleships, it's just a matter of persistence. You just have to keep trying until you get the 2 cruisers, and at that point, it becomes a really easy secondary condition. So that's the bit of randomization that I think is BS, that frankly I don't know why they did it. So this is the penultimate spawn, really. You always get this Colorado group coming in from, well, it's either east, west or south. You don't ever get any ships coming in from the north, basically, so that end of the map is protected. But now we've got this spawn coming in, and we've also got the Whiskey group of destroyers as well, which will try and occupy your repair base. So they're a separate secondary condition. You do have to take them down as well. But this is the part where it starts to get a little bit more frenetic. Not frenetic, but it becomes more of a Scrabble, because you don't know which direction things are going to come from. And in this case, much to my misfortune, it's again the south that the final big wave has spawned from, and this always has a tier 8 battleship with it. So in this case it's a North Carolina, but as I've said, I've also seen it be an Alabama as well. So it might come from the east, it might come from the west, and so you can end up with ships from 2 directions to deal with. But in this case they both came from the south, which in some ways made it easier for our team, but it's also put me in a hell of a position, because I was trying to be a bit more aggressive here, deal with that Colorado group and, you know, distract maybe some of the Whiskey group of destroyers, thinking that okay, the next group is going to come from the east or the west, but no, they then spawn from the south as well. So this is the part where it makes it really hard to plan ahead in terms of your positioning, and why it ends up being just a fight to stay alive in the middle of the map. So it looks like a relatively large map, and it is a relatively large map, but there's actually a comparatively small effective fighting area. So at this point I'm just under massive sustained fire from this entire group. There's destroyers around. None of these cruisers do have torpedoes though, of course, but yeah, I'm going to sink. You know, the reason I picked out the Nelson just to try out was I thought that, well, having said that, there's a Phoenix there, he's got torps, but yeah, too close to actually arm, not that it mattered. So yeah, the reason I picked out the Nelson was, my thinking was that, you know, I've got this massive heal, but I only really got to use the massive heal once. And so it turned out to be, you know, I've done a decent amount of damage, and I did take a right pounding, and also in some ways it wasn't a completely terrible move as it turned out, because I took a lot of focus from the bot ships, which meant my allies could have a bit more breathing room. It's not necessarily a bad thing to die in this particular operation if it buys time, because once you get to the latter half of it, it is absolutely about playing for time. It's not necessarily trying to kill all the enemy ships. You've got to kill the Whiskey group of destroyers, but beyond that, it's just keeping the airbase alive, not letting them get close enough, because it's got a decent chunk of health, but it's like any other base structure in an operation in that it doesn't take a lot of hits to kill it. So we've only got a couple of ships left alive at this point. The Hiryu, by the way, I mean, in terms of carrier positioning, the Hiryu's probably been in about the best place that you can be, but it is also possible to drive up towards the north and be closer to the airfield. Position yourself maybe just north of the atoll, but you might take fire doing so. So I think the Hiryu's positioning, if you are, for goodness sake, wow, okay, bit of a frog in my throat there. If you are in a carrier, I think the Hiryu's positioning was probably just about as good as it could be, in terms of them not having to have that much of a turnaround on their planes and being able to use a bit of island cover. So as it's going to turn out, the Hiryu will be the last one left alive, but we're down now to less than a minute and a half, so we've inflicted enough damage on these ships, and it really is only the 2 destroyers in the North Carolina left, that they're not really going to have enough time to get to the base, and it's just a question of if we get the forts. But as it turns out, yeah, there we go. We actually we did successfully complete that with 5 stars, and that was indeed my first 5-star run. So 190k damage done. My positioning, in retrospect, wasn't the best. I should have been maybe a little more cautious, but you know, I was still in the process of feeling my way around this, and I've played some rounds since, and sticking towards the centre is the best way to do it. But as you can see there, yeah, it was actually a Miyoko that had the best score of our team, presumably through doing damage to lots of destroyers and setting lots of fires as well. The Hiryu right down at the bottom there. Generally speaking, yeah, as I've said, this operation is particularly harsh on carriers. Even though they had 31 air kills, they didn't have a single surface kill. So don't take a carrier is my advice. Wargaming does not want you to take a carrier. There is so much defensive AA, and because it's all US AA as well, even if it's things without defensive, it's going to shred your planes, and there's limited value in shooting down the enemy planes. Yeah, an AA spec cruiser is far more valuable than a carrier in that regard. And if you're not there being able to do damage, then you're a bit of a drag on the team, unfortunately. A really skilled carrier player might be able to do something, but there's just so much defensive AA around that it completely negates the ability to make manual drops. So, yeah. I don't know. Wargaming really don't want people to take carriers in ops, and it's still doable for the tier 6 ops, but for this one, absolutely not. So, yeah. So, recommended ships. The German battleships, definitely the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. As I've said, the Belfast is really good. The Fiji is okay. The Algerie actually might be all right. What else did I mention? The Miyoko is kind of okay. Probably overall the best of the heavy cruisers, but I don't know. As I've said, the Algerie might be all right as well. And in terms of destroyers, I think anything with either long-lasting smoke or that's a gunboat destroyer, basically, because it is kind of hard to hit the torps. But as with previous operations, you know, the destroyers do get focused pretty hard. So overall, it's not that destroyer-friendly either. So that's the final frontier, the first of the tier 7 operations. You know, if I was going to give this one a rating, it'd be like a, I don't know, 2.5 out of 5, something like that. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see though. Maybe they'll add some more higher tier operations than tier 6 and learn some lessons from this one, because it feels like it's been made challenging in the wrong way. It's not challenging because of the secondary conditions or anything like that. It's challenging because they throw a bunch of stuff at you, and the fact that one of the secondary conditions is entirely reliant on RNG and getting 2 cruisers instead of 2 marked battleships, yeah, that's not the right kind of RNG at all. So hopefully you found this guide useful, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.